Hey everyone, you're listening to the TEN7 Podcast, where we get together every fortnight, and sometimes more often, to talk about technology, business, and the humans in it. I'm your host, Ivan Stegic. In this episode of the podcast, we're talking to Chris Dart, who has been in the field of technology since 1996, when he was troubleshooting issues with FileMaker Pro and Macintosh systems. He's the technology director at Friends School of Minnesota, a K-8 Quaker school in St. Paul. He's a developer here at TEN7, and he is also one of the founding members of the Red House community, a small intentional community formerly in the heart of St. Paul. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
It's technology, man. Hello.
Welcome. I think you forgot to mute yourself or unmute yourself. It's nice to have you on.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here.
So, shall we start where we always start? Where are you from and where did you grow up?
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but only lived there for about 4 years. And my dad was a doctor. He got a position in the Marshfield Clinic in Marshfield, Wisconsin, which is right in the middle of the state. They have a large clinic there, surprisingly large given the location. So we moved there in 1974 or so, and I grew up there and graduated from high school there. Then I went to McAllister College in St. Paul, and I've kind of been in the Twin Cities ever since.
McAllister in St. Paul. You ended up studying cultural anthropology there. What is cultural anthropology?
Well, cultural anthropology is basically the study of how humans construct their world together. It's a little different from sociology. Sometimes the line gets blurred, but it's a bit more storytelling than statistics, I think would be a good way of differentiating the two fields.
And you majored in ethnography and medical anthropology, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I want to learn a little more about both of those majors, but I'm also fascinated how that led to a career in technology. A lot of the guests We've had on the show end up studying something that's liberal arts related or non-science related, but end up in technology. So let's hear it.
Well, so ethnography is basically a systematic way to get into the minds of a people in a particular subculture or group. And there's a sort of many different structured processes to do that. You want to get sort of a collection of what they might call a taxonomy of ideas or terms, that a hierarchy of notions. And medical anthropology is specifically the study of how people view health and illness. So, for instance, a good example is if you're studying, like if you mention cancer to an oncologist, for instance, they're going to want to know what specific cancer, what are the genetic coding on it, how long did you have it, what stage was it? Very specific questions. To the average person on the street, the medical anthropology of that is cancer is a serious disease whose treatment seems sometimes worse than the disease itself, which isn't true, but it's a perception, and that's how people see it. And when people get cancer, they get scared. So a lot of lingering culture perceptions around that. So that's kind of what medical anthropology studies is: how do people perceive health and illness? How do they respond to health and illness? Now, how that all ties together to technology, I think the way that I use it is, I'd started out, I didn't have very good math instruction, science instruction. I don't want to really blame the teachers, but it was sort of I didn't really feel like it was the right fit for me in college. But when I started working as a community organizer in the 90s, I realized more and more that it was just not the right job for me. It being, I did use a lot of ethnography there to find out about what priorities people had, what do they consider concerns or goals, and collectively what were the views of the people, try to synthesize that into some kind of way to help them take action in their world. And what I ended up doing, because community organizing is notoriously open-ended, is I ended up sort of finding succor in technology and sort of, it's got sort of a fairly closed process. There's a problem, you can solve it, you can say that you're done, or at least you have an idea of how to solve it. Things are a little more sort of closed or tidier, I think. And I started helping people out with technology, and eventually I continue to use ethnography when I communicate with clients. It's finding out how they see things, especially when you get deep into the field. It's really important to be able to step outside of it, much like the example of the oncologist versus the average person, that sometimes treatment can be difficult for people because the doctor seems aloof, or they talk about things in ways that are too complicated. And in the same way, when people are dealing with technology, it is, like Arthur C. Clarke said, fairly akin to magic in a lot of ways. And even to me, some things, and I know we hear about that with AI, that there's a good deal of it that we have to use AI to figure out because we don't even understand it. And so anyway, that's sort of that's how I ended up. That's how I use it now. I think I still use it as a way to I use the tools to help communicate with people.
So chances are pretty good that you have a better understanding and perhaps a deeper interest in our current politics from an ethnographic standpoint than any of the rest of us.
Maybe. It's hard to get outside your own, when it's an emotional thing like politics, it's hard to get outside of your own perspective. But that's something that I try to do, and I think it's a good discipline.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into politics, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question. So your studies in anthropology led to a career in technology, but you also were at school at the University of Liverpool in England. Is that correct?
Well, they were one of the first bricks and mortar schools to provide an online program. So I did everything right here in St. Paul.
Oh, but you did?
It was like with people from all over the world, and it was a little clunky. They had this interface for chat. It was back in 2006, 7, 8, I think. And it was a pretty rigorous program. I have to say, I looked at all the different programs, and I don't think the U of M had one yet at the Humphrey. I think it was where they were offering it, and then University of Chicago at Urbana-Champaign, I had a program, but it wasn't really, I think that a lot of them were still sort of dipping their toes in it, and I guess Liverpool just decided to dive in. And in England, they have a system that, as my understanding, is that they have a review board. Some sort of unusual is that all the courses that you take at a university that's accredited by the government, so it's not like there are private accreditors, accredited by the government, that they review the coursework and they review the courses to make sure that an A at Liverpool and an A in Birmingham and an A in at the new school or wherever is the same, like that. You don't get grade inflation in one place. So sometimes you get a grade, and then maybe a few months later, there's a review, like a sort of sample. They just like pick a course at random. There's a review, and then your grade goes down. You're like, And I think that was my understanding. I don't know for sure, because it was sort of, it was a little difficult to do that online. It was still a new technology. There was still a lot of it was hard to, there's a lot of things you miss when you're trying to communicate with people in person. You can have like a get together at a coffee shop and sort of go over the coursework. And there was a, strict rules about collusion. And I think people were really afraid to do anything outside of, chat outside of the main thread, because they were afraid that it might be construed as collusion, and so it was very strict.
Wow, I didn't realize that your experience with remote work and remote learning was that went that far back. You didn't have any kind of video solution?
No, it was all text. No, and they didn't offer. The lectures were basically just a Word document. And then we would discuss it. So it's kind of what they call flipped education, where you basically read the lecture on your own and then spend your time in the sort of class chat room talking about the lecture, and you had to cite everything, every time you talked, which was an interesting thing, is that you can't talk out of your butt. You have to actually cite your sources, and so that was it was pretty interesting, and I did learn a lot. I got a good overview of all the technology that was available at the time, and so that was interesting.
And when you graduated, did you go over to England to walk down the stage?
I wanted to, yeah, I wanted to, but I just I think it was just timing didn't work, and it was I just, it would have. Liverpool, I think, is kind of like, I don't want to offend anybody, but it's kind of like Gary or Toledo or something. It's just sort of like this. It's not a very. I mean, it didn't seem like a very interesting place. It's like the Beatles were there, but otherwise, it's kind of just another industrial town that's kind of hit on hard times. But the school is very good. They've got a good program there. But no, I thought about it. Just timing wasn't right.
And in between doing your studies at McAllister and at Liverpool, I mean, there were about 10 years or so there. And I would assume that was kind of the beginning of the arc into technology. But that's also about the same time where you founded an intentional community, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm fascinated by an intentional community. My wife and I have talked about it ourselves for a number of times, but more as an idea other than something we would do. So can you give listeners a definition of what an intentional community is?
Well, it can be anything from, say, an Amish community, in central Wisconsin, for instance, or to sort of maybe more on the darker side, something like the David Koresh group. You can have a variety of things. It's where people, but then for the most part, in our context, and I think for the most part, intentional community is it can be anything from those things to just more than roommates, where you have more of a commitment to each other, and you maybe have some shared resources, and you make a commitment to being present with each other more than you would if, say, you were just friends living in a house together, or a rooming house or something like that. It's definitely and so there's that. It's a big range, but that's kind of, yeah. And
you started the community that you're a part of in 1997. How many co-founders did you have?
There were 6 of us.
And whose idea was it?
I think ultimately it was my idea. There were other people who were very interested in it, but I had been sort of pushing for it and talking to friends about it and talking it up, and there were about 10 people who ended up being interested in it. And it was a pretty tough process to sort of decide. It was a lot of, those GRE logic questions where it's like, Mary will only eat pizza on Tuesday if John has hamburgers on Monday. It was kind of like figuring out who would be willing to live with each other and come up with a group. And so, some people were disappointed they didn't get to participate in it. And, I could look back and say, well, it would have been interesting if they had been a part of it and not these other people. And, but that's how it turned out. And we had all been, we were all alumni of a program called the Lutheran Volunteer Corps, at some point in the previous few years, and that's a program where you spend a year or two living in a core city somewhere in the United States. They have locations all over, and you have a household of 4 to 8 people, and you work in some kind of social justice work. And you pool all your food costs, and you have about, at the time, $110 to spend on personal spending. So it's like living in sort of intentional poverty, but not really. I mean, it's you have your safety net that a person actually living in poverty doesn't have. You've got your parents, you've got a savings account, whatever. But it's a way of, and the 3 tenets were simplicity, community, and social justice. And so we focused on those 3 things. And I think once I got out of LVC, I really missed it. I felt like I had not expected to find intentional community, to be the most. For me, it was the most satisfying part of the LVC experience. And so we got together and we found a house in St. Paul, and it was a pretty nice place. It had rooms where two people doubled up, but otherwise we all had our own room. And we basically modeled it after the LVC model, where we had a food budget, and we'd pool our money, and this stayed the same throughout the entire time. Somewhere between 100 and 130 it ended up being a month. That was all for the food, and you would put it on a whiteboard. This stayed the same the whole time, as you would basically write your list of ingredients, either for your own, like sort of like if you wanted coffee or breakfast food or whatever, or what you plan to cook for the house for that week. Put it on the whiteboard, and then a person or a team were volunteered to go and do the shopping. And we had a joint account for a long time, a joint checking account, and you would do the shopping. And it was set up so that we'd have enough money in the pool that we could basically accommodate pretty much everyone's personal desires. So like if you drank coffee and no one else did, that's fine. $8 maybe every 2 weeks or whatever. Or you wanted marshmallow mateys, that was popular for a while for a couple of us, that we would get that, and it was fine. If somebody else didn't like to eat breakfast, it ended up coming out in the wash. You were still spending less than you would be had you been living alone, because you would get a meal cooked for you once every, you would 4 nights out of 5 in a week. We started out with 6, but it ended up going down to 5 people, then 4 at one point. But, you would get, as much as 4 nights a week meals cooked for you, and then leftovers. Usually we cooked big batches, stews and things like that, so that you really didn't have to spend a whole lot of your personal money on food unless you wanted to go out or whatever.
And was the intentional community some sort of a legal organization, or you mentioned a joint checking account, but it wasn't like it was a specific co-op or a legal construct that you had to do your taxes together, for example.
No, there was no joint ownership, no like shares that you purchase. Basically, the closest thing to a share is just that you would put your rental deposit in the kitty, or basically you would pay the person moving in. If you're leaving, somebody's leaving, then you would put your money in the kitty, that you would pay them your rent deposit.
And so, Chris, do you think it was easier to rent or to buy a house for the intentional community?
We had looked at renting, and a lot of the houses that were in our price range were really crappy. So we started looking at buying, and it turns out the monthly payments for a mortgage were quite reasonable. And so finding a house that would accommodate us, 4 to 5 bedrooms, was a fairly easy process, and we found one not too far from where we were. And we so just one housemate and I decided to buy. We had looked at doing cooperative type venture, but that the funding wasn't there, and it was hard to sort of organize a structure in a single dwelling. It'd be more like if you wanted to buy a fourplex or something. So yeah, we bought the house, and 3 of us moved, and we opened up. At the time, we would advertise by putting flyers up in coffee shops and advertising in the women's press. We found that other papers didn't. You'd get a lot of people who didn't read it, or just looking for a house, place to live, and we wanted to really make sure people understood what they were getting into. It was not just housemate situation.
So how has the marketing of intentional communities and finding new housemates changed then since you started this in 20 years ago?
Oh, a lot.
I bet.
So Craigslist came along in, I don't remember about that when what that was, but that became a way to do it. But we would get emails saying, cancel your post. I'll advance you $2,000. My height is this. My measurements are this. And it was like, what?
What?
Just like they were looking for, I don't know what. I don't, So we would. I started developing websites, and I had, and decided to create a web form that people could email. And I can't remember when that was, but we would redirect people to our website to fill out the form. I don't remember when about we did this. May have been late 2000s, and have them fill it out instead of answering to the Craigslist email, and that filtered out almost everyone. That, you had to read through the form, you had to answer certain questions, nothing big, but just, acknowledge that you'd read it and this is not a housemate situation, but there's a bit more commitment to it. And that really improved the quality of the people that we were getting, because before it was really hard to find people. I mean, there isn't a network. At about the same time, an organization that's been around for a long time called the Fellowship of Intentional Communities. We discovered that. Somebody pointed it out to me, and it's ic.org, and they have a huge database of intentional communities, and you fill out a form asking what kind you are. Are you a single leader? Everyone pays everything in. Is it a commune? Is it religious community? Do you have land? Are there shares? All that kind of stuff. What is your structure like? How do you choose your leadership? All that kind of thing. And so we would fill it out, and we got people interested through that. Some people would go there and find a link to our website and then fill out the form, and other people found us through Craigslist. And then we would also occasionally post on Facebook, but really the intentionalcommunities.org and the Craigslist were the way that we got most of the people. And then word of mouth was another way.
And I would assume you did a background check and all kinds of other references for the people that you're inviting into the house once the applicant was accepted?
Not really. We never did background checks. And
wow.
It sounds good.
Sounds scary.
Well, the way it works is and I think a lot of communities do this, when you're asking for people to make a commitment, first of all, you filtered out people who are a little shady. I mean, it's like they people who are going to take the risk to try to come and stay with you and interact with you, and that. So we always had people over for a meal, and we would, just have dinner with them or lunch or tea or something, snacks. And we would talk to them, and then we give them a tour of the house. And then we would have a conversation in the living room about their favorite activities. Are they from the area? What do they like to do when they're not? What do they? Where do they work? A lot of that stuff helped us determine. If somebody had a good paying job, and we never had any real trouble. There were a couple situations where it was really hard to find people, and sometimes we made decisions that were a little too expedient and not the best. I don't think that only happened once, and that person left within a week, and we got to keep the rent deposit, and it was okay. It was a little weird, but that was like a long distance. Like, we did a phone interview, and we decided we'd never do that again. You have to come and meet with us, that we have to meet you face to face. And we've had some oddballs come. I mean, there was a person who was not sort of psychologically typical, I'd say, and that was hard to get them to leave. It was a little awkward, but I think it's kind of part of living in community is taking a risk with people, and so we really wanted to make sure that it felt open. It's an open process and a sort of positive view.
So lots of gut checks, lots of FaceTime, spending time with the potential new community member. Everybody gets a say. It sounds like that's most certainly enough instead of or in addition to a background check. So I'm kind of not surprised that works, and it seems to be completely consistent with the tenets of an intentional community.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we wanted to make sure that people feel like they're joining a group as an equal, and that I think in some ways, if you're doing a lot of checking on people, you look at their Facebook profile or MySpace page, and But
MySpace.
Yeah, back in the day.
Blast from the past.
Right.
So it sounds like you were at around 5 or 6 people in your intentional community. Can you talk to me about the size? Is it typical of what other intentional communities are? How did you guys land on that number?
Well, I think it's hard to find housing that's big enough to have more people, but the U of M, there's a co-op at the U of M that's a student co-op. I don't know in what way that it's a co-op, but I've been there, and it's like an old, it's like a frat house. It's very big, lots of rooms, industrial kitchen, and I think for us in a small community, it has to be between 5 and 7. In LVC, that was certainly the way with Lutheran Volunteer Corps. That's the way it worked best. You have fewer than 5, and it can often end up being 3 and 1, where 3 people sort of get along and one person doesn't, and they feel excluded. With 5, it's often a moving target where there can be 3 and 2, and then that switches a little bit, but it's always a little that way. Then nobody feels isolated in the group unless they're not very good at socializing, which that did happen at the community, and that was frustrating when you get somebody who's there and isn't very good at being, they don't have very good social skills or whatever.
Yeah, I think the cooperative at the University of Minnesota that you mentioned, I think that one's called Students Cooperative. I was reading about that earlier, and I think they're at about, is it a dozen, maybe 2 dozen folk? But you're right.
2 dozen.
It's like a 3-story house and has 5 bathrooms and really community living.
Yeah, looks like a college dorm. It's kind of crappy inside, but it's it's like college student crappy. It was like but it's very idealistic. There's a lot of there's a lot of vision there. There's a lot of sort of idealism in that place.
What's the hardest thing you've ever had to do as part of the intentional community?
Oh, well, we had a housemate, and this person they matched us up really well. They were a very good fit, but they had a problem with substance abuse, and they were on the wagon. They were working very hard to keep on the wagon. We felt like we would be able to do it, but we really didn't know much about that. I didn't know how that worked, and she ended up falling off the wagon, and it happened gradually. We didn't really understand what was going on. She just seemed more and more isolated, and then I take a medication that's restricted, and she took it. And then she ended up getting very sick with a heart condition, and she was in the hospital in the ICU. And we had to tell her mom that she had to move out. And it was really hard because she was, on death's door at the time. And she did actually die about 6 months later. And it was really a challenge because we didn't have the tools to do. We realized that we can't be all things to all people. The people who come to the community have to be stable. They have to be, well employed. Those are the things that are really critical, and that we were all very, want to make everybody feel welcome, and we shouldn't be discriminating against people. But in this case, she just wasn't ready, and then, along with that, compounding health issues, she just hurt, it hurt her too much. And then she stole, and it was like, that was just, that we couldn't have that. So that was the hardest thing.
My goodness. And was that early on in the intentional community?
No,
or was that later on?
It was later on. It was like after what I would call like sort of probably the most exciting period in the community. We had 3, there were just it was a good mix of people for a while, and then one person moved out, and then this person moved in, and she tried, we tried, but it was probably about halfway into the life, or 3/4 of the way into the life of the community.
So it wasn't like it was when you first started out that it kind of put you off actually doing this. You had already had a ton of experience and unfortunately had this issue. I was going to ask you about how you decided and what happened when you decided that it was time to end the intentional community. How did that all shake out? Because I know that happened recently.
It did, and I'm glad to have this opportunity because talking about it now that I've had a little time to reflect on it. The community was disbanded in March of this year, and it had been coming a long time. I'm in my late 40s, and I was starting to feel a little old. Most of the people who had come to the community were in their late 20s and early 30s, newly entered into the professional career or in college for graduate school or something like that. They were, but I was feeling older and older. But also, we had a dynamic where the person I originally bought the house with sold it, and bought it, and then a person that was there who seemed like she was a very responsible person, and I didn't want to end the community, so she bought out the former co-owners portion of it, and we refinanced, and it turned out she had a very different understanding of what community could be or should be, and she has a very transactional view of it. It certainly is a way to save money, and she was very interested in limiting her expenses, and a very frugal person, but not the most. She did not have very good skills at sort of engaging with people and inviting people in, making them feel welcome. And it got to be increasingly a burden on me to sort of make sure that everyone who was new was welcome and to sort of, build the cohesion with new members. Because that's always a job when you got a new person, is you want to make sure that they feel like they are a part of the whole, part of the group, and that they're welcome to be an equal, and that that didn't work very well. And I think and she was starting to feel, I think that too, that it was it was outside of her comfort area, and it took a long time, and it was hard, but it was the right thing to do. It was time to end. I had thought at one point that I would just do intentional community until I retired, and then move into a senior living facility where I would just continue. But I'm taking a break now. One of my housemates I met, Emily, we ended up finding that we clicked really well and fell in love, and we decided to buy a house together this summer, and we've been living here. So it's a big change for me, but it was a time to do it, and I feel good about it. I feel like it wasn't how I would have wanted to end it, but I could never picture how it could end easily. Just.
Well, congratulations on the new house. And you've kind of done an extension of the intentional community, except it's just 2 members now.
2 members and a dog. And then over the summer, we tried raising ducks because the house had a duck run, and all 6 of them died. And so we went through our first 6 housemates very quickly, but now we got a dog, and it's going okay. So
yeah, I hope that lasts longer than your ducks.
Yes.
What do you not miss now that you're no longer part of the community?
Oh, I think the kind of things that most people would think of when they think of living with others. Who's leaving the dishes undone, who's got sort of peculiar quirks, or doesn't clean up after themselves, or hogs the TV, which really ended up not being as big a problem later on. It was more getting people out of their rooms and back into the common space, but and then dealing with personality conflicts. That was, those are the things that I don't miss.
Very, very diplomatic, Chris. Appreciate that. Before we wrap up talking about intentional communities, I do have a couple more questions. What would be the best place to go online to find out more about intentional communities, good resources to look at in case there are any listeners out there that are interested in following up?
Well, the Fellowship of Intentional Communities is still a pretty good resource. It's definitely for finding like places where you would, live like a farm or something like that. But they have small communities like ours. The other place is that there's a group online on the Facebook called Intentional Communities Twin Cities or Minneapolis, St. Paul. I can't remember the name, but I can share it with you when we get off. And that's a place where there's some pretty active communication of people looking for housemates, looking for houses, wanting to start one up, and just for the Twin Cities area. I don't have anything bigger than that, but that's one of the that's the two resources that we've pointed people to in the past.
Okay, we'll get that information from you offline, and we'll publish that in the show notes and in the transcript on the web. Now, I know you were in a bagpipe band, and I also, if I'm not mistaken, seem to recall that you were in a barbershop quartet. Is that right?
I'm in a barbershop chorus. A quartet is quite, especially if you're serious about it, is like any kind of band, is quite a commitment. But I sing in the Great Northern Union Chorus, which is a barbershop harmony society, a very competitive chorus. Can you hear my dog snoring? Just hold on a second.
Yeah, I can.
Hold on a second.
I don't know how that's going to get transcribed.
Hang on a second. Can we pause for a moment?
Or we could leave it on. That's also
okay,
fine.
Right. Yeah, she does that. She's got this she's a little tiny dog, but she snores quite loudly. Anyway, the Great Northern Union is a competitive barbershop chorus. We've been in the top 10 at every international contest we've been to since the chorus was formed. And we...
Wow.
So barbershop chorus is a little different than quartet because you can do things that a quartet can't really do. I mean, you can push the voices a little farther because you don't need all the voices on every note all the time, and so you can hold notes longer, and you can and you can push the range, stuff like that. And so it's kind of fun, and I think that probably a lot of people would say that the best place to be when in a barbershop chorus is on the risers, because that's where you get the goosebumps. You hear the voices around you, and those 7 chords resolving to a dominant or tonic chord or whatever resolving is it's very pleasing and powerful experience. It's high energy.
When is your next performance?
It's in December. I can put that in the show notes. I don't have the actual date on mind, but it's in mind. But it's in early December, and it's a Christmas themed show, a holiday show, but we'll be doing our contest set and some other contest related type pieces, so that'll be fun.
It sounds like a lot of fun. I remember singing in the choir in high school for 4 years, and it was some of the most fun I'd ever had with a group of people. So that's awesome. Do you have a website?
Yeah, gnusings.com.
gnusings.com. Do you know about Minnesota Sings, the community sing? We've gone to those a number of times in the last few years, and it is such fun. You show up, sometimes it's in a park, sometimes it's in a community center, and it's led by 2 or 4 people, and they have songs that they sing, hippie songs, hymns. They hand out all of these pamphlets with all the words, and if you don't know the melodies, doesn't matter. You sing as best you can. That was a lot of fun. Going to those has been a lot of fun, and I think their website is mnsings.com. That's what reminded me was gnusings.com, kind of similar. Well, before we go, could you recommend a book that I should read and that the listeners should take interest in?
Well, I think that the book that's probably the best, the best for tech listeners would be "Exploding the Phone," and it's a book that I listened to earlier this year, and it was about sort of the original hackers of the phone, the Bell telephone network. It's a blind kid who in Florida, and the phone is kind of a place for him where it puts him on an even playing field with other people, because sighted people have the same, it's the same disadvantage or advantage. And but he starts to hear the tones. They use that multi-tone signaling. And I can't remember what it's called, but he learns how to mimic those sounds, and he eventually figures out how to basically hack the phone system using whistles. And another guy had got a slide whistle from Captain Crunch that he learned to use, and they sort of created this underground community of hackers who'd figured out how to crack into the phone system and do fun stuff like just create conference calls. And all this was before everything was switched to digital, so the 60s, 70s era. And they got into trouble with the law, and back then, Ma Bell was the law. I mean, it was sort of, if they wanted the FBI to go after you, it would happen.
It was easy.
Yeah. So it's really
phone hacking.
Exploding the phone. And I can get you the full details in the notes. I don't have the name of the author in front of me, but it's an entertaining read, very interesting read.
Very good. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Chris, thank you so much for spending your time with me.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
It was my pleasure. Chris is online at cerebratorium.com, cerebratorium.com. You've been listening to the TEN7 Podcast. Find us online at ten7.com/podcast. And if you have a second, do send us a message. We love hearing from you. Our email address is podcast@ten7.com. Until next time, this is Ivan Stegic. Thank you for listening.